You're good to go.
Oh, we're good? Yeah. I'd like to call to order the Middletown City Council special meeting for Thursday, August 12th, 2021. Ms. Skink, will you please call the roll for us?
Ms. Vittori.
Here.
Ms. Nanny.
Here.
Mr. Moon.
Here.
Mr. Mulligan.
Here.
Mayor Condrey.
Here. Do I have a motion to receive and file the special meeting documents for this meeting?
So move for adoption.
Second.
Ms. Skink, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Nanny.
Yes.
Mr. Moon.
Yes.
Mr. Mulligan.
Yes.
Mayor Condrey.
Yes.
Ms. Vittori.
Yes.
Okay, so this evening we have afternoon, we have multiple parts. First, we have a motion to move to an executive session. We'll have a work session after that to discuss the budgeting and allocation of the Federal American Rescue Plan Act funds. And then we'll have do we actually vote on this today?
We will have
Yes, okay, I thought so. It was timely, right? So we'll have a ordinance vote for an emergency legislation item. So, under the authority of ORC 121.22G3, conferences with an attorney for the public body concerning disputes involving the public body that are the subject of pending or imminent court action, and under the authority of ORC 121.22G8, to consider confidential information related to the marketing plans, specific business strategy, production techniques, trade secrets, or personal financial statements of an applicant for economic development assistance, or to negotiations with other political subdivisions respecting requests for economic development assistance, provided that both of the following conditions apply. One, the information is directly related to a request for economic development assistance that is to be provided or administered under any provision of Chapter 715, 725, 1724, or 1728, or Section 701.07, 3735.67 to 3735.70, 5709.40 to 5709.43, 5709.61 to 5709.69, 5709.73 to 5709.75, or 5709.77 to 5709.81 of the revised code, or that involves public infrastructure improvements or the extension of utility services that are directly related to an economic development project. And two, a unanimous quorum of the public body determines by a roll call vote that the executive session is necessary to protect the interests of the applicant or the possible investment or expenditure of public funds to be made in connection with the economic development project. Do I have a motion to move to executive session for this reason?
So move for adoption. Second.
And Ms. Skank, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Moon.
Yes.
Mr. Mulligan.
Yes.
Mayor Condrey.
Yes.
Ms. Nanny.
Yes.
Ms. Vittori.
Yes.
And as I stated, after we finish that executive session, we'll come back into open session for a work session, followed by a vote on the legislation.
We're going to go up to 2C.
Absolutely.
Do I have a motion to return to open session?
So move for adoption. Second.
Ms. Skank, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Mulligan.
Yes.
Mayor Condrey.
Yes.
Ms. Vittori.
Yes.
Ms. Nanny.
Yes.
Mr. Moon.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the patience of the large crowd. So now we have a work session we're going to hold to discuss the budgeting and allocation of the Federal American Rescue Plan Act funds. Mr. Pelenick, the floor is yours.
It's not on, nope. Now it is.
All right. So, we had been promising for some time, obviously, to really get into the American Rescue Plan Act funding. And of course, I think by this time, most people recognize that last year, the federal $1.9 trillion stimulus plan that ultimately became known as the American Rescue Plan Act was approved at the federal level. And in that program was determined fairly significant allocations on a formula basis to CDBG entitlement communities. And of course, the city of Middletown is one of those CDBG entitlement communities. So based on the formula, we were allocated $18,925,154 under the American Rescue Plan Act. Specifically in May of this year, May of 2021, we actually received $9,462,577. That's in a bank account, separately segregated earning interest on our behalf. And on May 22, next year at approximately the same time that we received the first payment, we will receive the other half, or the additional $9,462,577. And these funds have to be fully spent through the end of 2024. So December 31st, 2024, we have to spend all of these funds, and we have to do so in a means that are consistent with the federal legislative guidance. So the federal legislative guidance, in this case, really spells out 4 primary purposes, and those purposes are specifically responding to COVID-19 or its negative economic impacts, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these, what these really mean. Responding to essential workers by providing what is so-called premium pay, and we'll define that for you. Necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And this is rather interesting because they clearly spelled these out only, and in doing so, they made it clear other things weren't to be under this. So you don't see roads, you don't see bridges, you don't see parks, you don't see a lot of things, you don't see civic buildings. What you do see is only water, sewer, and broadband. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, the provision of government services to the extent of a reduction in revenues. We'll sort of take you through what that means and how we calculate it, and why in some cases that gives some cities, and perhaps in our case, some flexibility in ultimately meeting the guidance under the federal program. So when we look at the first area, which is responding to COVID-19 or its negative economic impacts. Now, within that category, and this is an area that in many cases really allow us to do some of the things that we're going to propose, we can provide assistance specifically to households, to small businesses, as well as to nonprofits. We can aid impacted industries, and the industries that are called out in the legislation very specifically are tourism, travel, and hospitality. Of course, as you know, the industries that were probably the most negatively impacted by the pandemic, because in many cases they had to shut down entirely, were hotels, cruise ships, in many cases restaurants, things tied to tourism, to travel, and to hospitality. And then in response to the disease itself or any of the economic harms that resulted from or were exacerbated by the pandemic. So as we go through some of our larger items, you'll see that they sort of fall within this area of dealing with the negative economic impacts, and in particular, aiding impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. The second area was responding to essential workers by providing so-called premium pay. And there's a very clear definition in the legislation of what premium pay is. Premium pay is basically providing employees that you consider to be essential, and they give us a lot of latitude in that. Essential was basically anybody that was working during the pandemic, that responded in some way during the pandemic, and that were seen to be necessary to continue to provide the services and the other things that you were required to do. We can provide up to $13 per hour in addition to the wages that were already received, but that's the maximum, not more than $13 per hour, and no one employee could exceed $25,000 for any additional payments. And this is for work performed any time since the beginning of the pandemic, so it can be retroactive. So literally it can go back to any point in the pandemic and continue as it continues, and we must deem them essential. The number 3 area, as we talked about, was specific to infrastructure as water, sewer, or broadband. Now, within those areas, those improvements that we make would still have to be necessary to provide an adequate minimum level of service. So you probably almost certainly could not extend a new line somewhere because it was for, economic development. But if it was to provide a minimum level of service to a particular thing that, otherwise didn't have it, that would work. It can include wastewater treatment, plant improvements, improving of infrastructure resilience. It has to address water quality, which including stormwater, water pollution. Can include private projects on privately owned infrastructure. It is very difficult, we have determined, to apply any of these funds to broadband unless you are increasing access. And access in this case is not economic access. So the fact that someone pays too much for broadband and can't use it because they can't afford it, that's not access. Access is physical access, the very idea that it doesn't exist at all or it doesn't exist at a high enough speed to be able to use it. So for instance, if you have school kids that, have no access to it at all because physically in their neighborhood it's not available at all, then certainly that's fair, that's reasonable. But if it's because they can't access it because it costs too much, you can't do that. Also, the big telecoms really have been very adept at lobbying to make sure that municipalities have a very, very hard time using this to do anything that looks like it's competitive to what they do, which is selling broadband. So this is really pretty limited. The other thing about that is there's huge amounts of additional money given to the state for this, and there's an additional huge amount, something on the order of $65 billion, that the new infrastructure bill would still give to this. So they seem to be throwing massive amounts of money at particularly on the broadband side, with no real design or desire or model as to how to use it, except that in most cases they're telling municipalities how you can't use it. And then finally, the last is sort of an interesting category, and this gets where the flexibility is in many cases. The provision of government services to the extent of reduction in revenues. So the way we determine reduction in revenues is you create a base year, and in our case, the base year is the most recent full fiscal year preceding the pandemic. So because our fiscal year is a calendar year, that's the year of 2019. That is our base year. So you calculate lost revenues for the first time beginning in 2020. So you're comparing 2020 to your base year, which is 2019. And then in addition, you look at 21, 22, and 23. So you have these 4 years that if you can show so-called lost revenues, you can backfill that using these funds. Now, in our case, it's highly unlikely maybe that we'll see much in the way of lost revenues after 2020, but we have been able to do a calculation on 2020. And in this case of where you use this, it has to support the direct provision of government services or aid to citizens, or you can sort of do this workaround, this, if you will. You give yourself the lost revenues, and then in effect use the monies that you otherwise would have budgeted for those general fund services to do the things that you otherwise wouldn't do. So, and you're seeing some communities talk about doing that. So for our base year, and this isn't absolute, but we've had our accountants, the folks that we use to do our comprehensive annual financial report and some of the other audited stuff that we do, take a look at this based on the legislation. They feel like our base 2019 year revenues are $75,629,872. Our 2020 actual revenues in comparison, $73,224,690. And when they talk about base revenues, what you take out of that is any federal funding that you receive, anything like that. You have to take out specifically anything that is received as a result of liquor taxes. So it's designed to show a normal, regular revenue stream, not something extraordinary. So clearly we had to take out the CARES Act funds. So understand that in 2020, we were more than made whole by the CARES Act. So when you look at 2020 compared to 2019, we had lost revenues of $2,405,182. But you may recall that we received something over $3.7 million in CARES Act. So we really came out better in 2020 than in 2019, even though our revenues were down by $2.5 million. We wound up getting CARES Act funds. But for the purposes of this legislation, our lost revenues were $2.4 million. However, there's a provision in this act that accounts for growth rates. So that makes it really interesting. So within the legislation, they have said that you can then apply a growth rate to determine whether you've had lost revenues, because they're accepting the fact that lost revenues is not just comparing it to the last year, but to the idea that you would continue to have a growth rate And if you didn't make that growth rate, you're actually losing that portion as well. So they've said that on a federal national basis, you can have either the higher of your actual 3-year average growth rate to the years previous, or 4.1%, whatever is higher. And of course, I came into this with the absolute belief that because Middletown had struggled so long financially, that certainly the 4.1 would be the higher, because we wouldn't have had a growth rate that would come close to that. Well, I think if we had a 10 or 12 or a 15 or a 20-year average, that would have been clear. It would have been very, very stable, very flat. But ironically, the 3 years immediately preceding 2019 were like the best years Middletown has ever had in terms of its growth rate. And it was primarily driven by some really big construction projects, which were a bit of anomalous and not happen all the time, but they were calculated in. So as a result, our actual 3-year average growth rate immediately preceding 2019 turns out to be 8.58%, which blew my mind. But that's the case. So now we have the right to take the higher of the two. So if we take the 8.58% compared to our base year revenues of 75.6 million, that now creates an actual so-called counterfactual revenue, which is what the legislation says we can use to determine lost revenues. And that number is now 82,100,000.
Is there a new slide?
Yeah, I didn't advance my slide, sorry. That new number is $82,120,549. Now you go less the 2020 actual revenues, and you see that our technically lost revenues for the purposes of this exercise are almost $9 million. So what that does do is it would give us some flexibility if we found that we didn't meet the criteria for some of these other things and had to rely on this idea of using lost revenues to backfill it, that opportunity would exist. It's odd, it's unusual, it seems anomalous, but at the same time, the legislation allows it, so it does exist. So that's the
Sorry,
preface.
Mr. Powell,
Yeah.
one question. So under the lost revenue, 8.895 million, that means that there's ARPA funds that would just go into the general fund for general fund usage if we decided to allocate that way?
It means that if we wanted to do that for certain types of general fund expenses, that yes, you could pay yourself back that and then use those dollars that you would otherwise have to do something else, so give yourself the flexibility to do it, basically.
But the money still has to be spent.
Oh,
by
absolutely.
2024.
Yeah, all of it has to be spent by 2024. And what you can't do, and this is very clear in the legislation, you absolutely cannot use it to lower taxes. You cannot use it to fund pensions. You cannot use it in effect to do anything that you would normally be required to do, or to, in effect, avoid a normal revenue stream that you would be producing and having in place. So the process we looked at when we started trying to imagine how to best budget this, of course, really got, and this because it was very hard on a PowerPoint to sort of create the entire matrix worksheet that I've provided in front of you. I just simply put the list with the actual budgeted request on here. But what's in front of you is sort of the matrix that says a lot of the decision making that we went into this, which is how did some of these projects look as a priority? Did we feel we can get some additional funding through Butler County? Could we get some additional funding from Warren County? Could the Middletown Community School District participate? Is there additional monies that we have through community development block grants or home funds, either from the CARES Act or from the normal entitlements that support this? And then are there also other places that are better to fund this? So each of your columns are looking at all of that so that we can say, how do we best accomplish a lot of these projects in the most strategic way and make these dollars go as far as they humanly could? So that's why we sort of laid this out the way it is, and it started to imagine why you would use the dollars the way you would. And we had about 28 different concepts or projects on here. Obviously didn't fund all of them. Tried to create some concept of priorities, but obviously that's very speculative. That can be argued, and we could go back and forth. That's not nearly so important as it is just to say that priority became a discussion point, and how do we look at it, and what did it, how
So,
did we get
Mr.
to it?
Powell, for the purposes of this list, is the the priority column that's not a rank, it's just a number? Or is it a rank?
It was designed to try to be a priority, but obviously it can be argued lots of different ways. And it's only sort of an internal effort at it, and it wasn't, ever established as sort of clear.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I just didn't want.
But it was an attempt to say, yes, the ones at higher levels are designed to be higher priorities, as opposed to as you were. And in some cases, the priority would be higher maybe because the belief is you have a better way to fund it. Not that the project isn't a higher priority, just that if there's a better way to fund it, it now has a lower priority for ARPA funds because there's a better way to fund it. So again, one could argue if you don't believe that, then it may raise one way or the other. Example would be the paperboard demo and remediation. I would argue that's one of the highest priorities we would have as a community. It's shown as 0 for ARPA because we think Butler County might fund it. So we've set it in there. So if they don't, we have to figure out a way, okay, how do we move some of these monies around? How do we do it? Because that's probably a really high priority project. So that's some of the discussion we need to have, is this issue of, some things are contemplated to be funded one way. If they don't get funded that way, do we have some flexibility to do something else? We can go through that as we talk about it. And if I could, I'll just kind of go through some of this stuff, ask questions as we do, and then as we get through more of it, we can kind of kick it all around, just so that you understand sort of the methodology and what we were thinking. The first project listed on there is water sewer projects, and that was there and a high priority simply because we knew that the ARPA said you can absolutely fund those projects. Now, there's not anything shown as a request to spend on there because in our case, enterprise funds have been working reasonably well to pay a lot of those projects. We didn't know any specific projects that come up immediately, but it also might be something that if you need to fund something there, then you could backfill somewhere else. But at this point, that was sort of a placeholder to say, we know that that's eligible. It didn't happen to have anything. The fire station's obviously a high priority project. We didn't put ARPA down there because the belief is that can be funded through the 1 mil levy, so it's contemplated as happening that way. Number 3A.
They are eligible, though, for ARPA funding the fire station?
They are not eligible unless we were to decide that some portion of the lost revenues would be backfilled and used that way. And I think you probably might have read a story in the Journal News recently that the city of Hamilton, I think the city manager there had quoted saying he was going to try to get a fire station funded. And I'm certain that that's what they were contemplating, was the idea that they too would have lost revenues, they would do the workaround and do it that way. Because technically, that's clearly not eligible in and of on its face to do that. Mm-hmm. But if you find this sort of workaround because of the lost revenues, that you could get to that. Large cleanup targeted, just for a long time wanted to see a substantial citywide targeted cleanup of the community where we really get into communities, do alley cleanups, do amnesties for people to bring in tires and white goods and electronics and anything and everything, and just really make an effort to do that, get a program like that started. And so not a huge amount of money, but $150,000 thought of to go there to sort of just in combination with a lot of the other sort of neighborhood efforts. It would aid the state route for Oakland neighborhood. It would aid a lot of other areas in the community. So that's the idea there. The project Celluloid, we just had an executive session to talk about that. That contemplates $7,750,000 that we think is necessary to ultimately make that project go. And again, you're going to see a theme in here, large-scale strategic projects geared to economic development that will ultimately work to develop lots of new jobs, lots of new investment, and lots of recurring money that will ultimately make the city's budget much more sustainable over time. So we get one-time dollars, want to try to make one-time efforts to have a transformative effect on the city and the city's budget. The next falls into that as well, the town mall. This would be primarily, not primarily, exclusively to make that major demand generator happen, what we've talked about, the indoor ice sheets. And it's $3.4 million. We've also showing Warren County producing an equal amount of $3.4 million. We've had real positive discussions there. We feel reasonably comfortable that they would wind up matching our dollars. We think the combination to get to $6.8 million would really make that project work. That kind of an equity jumpstart would really get it done. So it really gives us the chance, again, for that big, major strategic project that's going to make a big, big difference. So bookended by the riverfront to the town mall project.
Does that mean the city would have any ownership over the town mall or ICE destination, or is that just the city giving?
Yet to be determined. It probably would be owned by a port authority, might be the Warren County Port Authority, might be the Middletown Port Authority, it might be a nonprofit, it might be the private sector, but in order to do something like that, it takes a lot of public subsidy, and usually that's sort of upfront as part of a capital stack. So that would, help to make that happen. But the details of how that would look, we don't know yet. But it's probably something that would aid in the financing, probably a port authority or a new community authority, one of those kinds of special purpose jurisdictions set up to aid in financing that would wind up being the technical owner of it. The paperboard, extremely high priority. We have said Butler County on there. I think if Butler County funds anything we have, I feel reasonably confident that would be the major, most important thing that we would see happen. Obviously, there's some chance we don't get Butler County funding for it, and then we would have to punt and look at this and redo some of this budget. But we've imagined that gets funded, hopefully, by Butler County. The Manchester Snyder for housing, long-term project, we've imagined $1.5 million for that. We've shown 161.5 of other funds. That was our general fund that was used to acquire the property that you all are very familiar with not that long ago that was spent. The Community Youth Center, we had the joint meeting just this last week with the city and the schools. That shows the $2.1 million of the city funding of ARPA going to that. It contemplates the request to Butler County at $6 million, and then Middletown Community Schools for $4 million, so a $12,100,000. Now, that obviously could wind up smaller, if Butler County doesn't provide that much, provides less, it's something. But the schools have, I believe at this point, made at least a provisional commitment of their funding on the $4 million. So this would then contemplate us putting $2.1 million to it. City Hall.
Sorry, I have a question on the Manchester real quick. The funding that you have written down is for what purpose?
To incentivize the development of some high-quality housing there.
Okay.
Just basically, don't know yet the terms of what that does, but knowing that there's money that's going to have to help
book
to
market.
jumpstart a development on that site, we're just saying $1.5 million would go a long way to really get a high-quality developer to make that happen.
Thank you.
Do we have reason, are we kind of just throwing dollars at it, or do we have reason to believe that we've done enough research and there's a gap there that would lead to $1.5 million?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I feel reasonably comfortable with that.
Okay.
I feel like that would get us to the kind of development that would.
And just
make
for
sense.
reference, the previous project there was asking the city for a gap of how much?
Oh, Lordy.
A
Well,
lot more than that?
you have to look at all the things they were asking for, but what was the last proposal, Susan? It was $6 million.
They were looking for like a $5 million gap
It
to
was
be covered by the
6,
city.
I think, or something like that. It was really substantial. City Hall, there's millions and millions of dollars that really are needed at City Hall. The windows are bad, many places carpet, the roof, lots of different things. But this is one of those, a lot of things you just can't do general kinds of things. We could do backfill. But the one thing that we know absolutely is necessary here, because fundamentally, if anything happens, we're in trouble, is our generator absolutely has to be replaced. And if it goes out, which, it could relatively soon, then we have absolutely no backup. No backup for a jail, where prisoners are living and have to be taken care of. No backup for the police department, no backup for anybody. So that's just a critical piece. That's the one thing we felt had to absolutely be in here in terms of this building.
And what is the useful life of that, and how far past that useful life?
Oh, good God. It's,
I don't think the generator in this building has ever been replaced.
Okay.
And the size of the generator
So it only does the most important pieces of the building now, and it really needs to do the whole building.
And that 450 would cover the upgrade?
No, fully replace it
replacement?
completely. Full, complete, total replacement, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The Vale site, $1 million, as well as $1.3 million from the Community Development Block Grant Home Funds, and those are actually CARES Act home funds, so those are over and above. So we've got those funds just sitting there. With home funds, you can use in our particular district up to $16,300 per unit to aid in developing affordable housing. We think the combination of the home dollars and that million would really allow for some really high quality jumpstart to a really nice development of housing on the Vale site. So again, a big project that could, really happen as a result.
Would using those dollars require that we have a certain amount of affordable housing in that development?
The thing would be is we would make them go as far as we can, make it as judicious as possible. And the number I used was the most you can give per unit. You'd like to make it less to make it work. So you give the least amount to make them economically feasible as possible, but we know that on the home side, you could give up to $16,300 per unit. On the ARPA side, there's no limitation except that it's $1 million. So between $1 million and potentially $16,300 a unit of home, we could make a real difference. And this doesn't have to be multifamily. That can be single-family homes as well, so long as they're affordable. And the affordability is about who winds up owning them, under what circumstances.
Can you
So
define
either way,
affordability? Like, what does affordable housing mean?
totally determined by the Housing and Urban Development Department. It usually has to do with percentages of AMI, average median income in the region. They put out those numbers every year, and I don't have them in front of me, and I don't know what they are, but it has to do with, it falls within 60%, 80%, et cetera, and then it qualifies. And I think in this case, it's for the home, it's like 80% of AMI.
I want to be very careful with affordable housing. I heard that a lot the other night, and just, I don't know, I'll need to see a lot more information to get.
And I understand what you're saying, and there's a lot of trepidation, but affordable means that working people can afford it. People who make $50,000 a year, $60,000 a year, $45,000 a year, depending on the size of their household, that work. Not only a full job, maybe sometimes 2 jobs, but that's what they make. And now they've become qualified because they can't afford otherwise. They fall into 80% of average median income because of what they make, because of the size of their household. Now, as a result of that, the building, which is every bit as high quality as any other building that's market rate, is made available to them because somebody, being the federal government, has subsidized the actual cost of building it. There's no Section 8 vouchers, there's no vouchers to the individual, but their cost comes down because somebody is subsidizing the actual cost to construct. Whether it's low-income housing tax credit or home dollars, what we're doing is helping the builder out to make it affordable to the person to either rent or buy. But that person is not without means. Their means just are more modest. They're not, a professional that makes a higher salary.
And quality affordable housing is a key part of any robust community. I think it gets a bad name, but if you really look at
Exactly.
even Cincinnati right now is struggling because they lacked the foresight
You got to realize that
to put
most
the affordable housing piece in there, and it creates more problems than it solves. So to really understand it isn't just to look at it at kind of the face value, where I think people start to feel like, oh, that means dilapidated buildings, or it really isn't about that. So I
It can
think
mean
more.
providing a higher quality
Yes.
apartment or
Right.
living condition for a
Right.
more affordable price.
And if we're in Middletown, so we're talking about a large percentage of who our residents are.
The other thing is, and sort of is a sort of a point of context, and I've done these projects before, and we were talking to people about doing something like that here. A developer might do a project where there are 2 buildings side by side. They're exactly the same building. One building they've built exclusively with private financing, and it's market rate. The other building, which is a complete mirror image of it, as part of their capital stack, they have low-income housing tax credits with it. So, both the same building, both the same quality, but these units over here they now can make some of those units available to people at lower rents because they were subsidized with the housing tax credit. And in exchange for getting the housing tax credit, they have made a commitment for 15 years usually to say that so many of these units will be made available to people who pay less based on their income in order to rent there. But both buildings exactly the same, quality exactly the same, everything about it's the same. See it all the time. But it's affordable. Now we've created actual affordability and allow people that otherwise maybe couldn't typically live in a similar kind of a thing to feel like they're not ostracized, they're not apart from the rest of society, they're living in the same kind of a product that the person that is paying the market rate for it. And again, I don't know what this looks like, but the point is many communities across the country are actually demanding developers do that, and they're either incentivizing them to create more affordable housing, or they're actually penalizing people who don't, or they're making them do so many units for every units of market rate. So I know we have a very different dynamic here, but affordability doesn't mean a bad thing. In some cases, it just means providing high-quality new housing to people in our community that right now don't have a very good quality housing.
I would suggest if we go down that path, maybe we take some council field trips to see examples of maybe what the developer has done. I know we've done that with other cases. I want to get more comfortable with that.
Absolutely, I would agree with that entirely.
Just for point of reference as well, I just looked it up. The AMI for 2021 for these types of projects is a family of 4 making $68,300 a year.
There you go.
Just so we have a point of reference there.
And just a point of reference for Rick, Jim was tying his shoelace.
I'm sorry.
He gave you a funny look there.
Sorry about that. Okay. Sometimes you just have to. Then working down the list, the next two items, the AK Headquarters and Serta, both of those are basically the sites that used to be AK Steel's headquarter and research areas along State Route 4. And as you know, from our Butler County request, 1.6 million and 1.57 million we've asked, again, made up in those. And then we were suggesting putting 125,000 in each case to that. And that's really about demolition and remediation, so that in combination with paperboard and those two, we wind up with 57 acres of high-quality research and development, Commerce Park for new jobs in the future along State Route 4.
What's the 225 on the other, on the Serta?
That's actually what we paid for it. That was when we recently bought the property. So that came from the city's general fund reserve. Bender Track we've listed on here as a priority project, but we're not asking or needing any funds from ARPA for that. Housing in Oakland, again, part of the Butler County request. We have $375,000 designated for demolitions, $706,400 for new builds. And on the city ARPA side, we have $187,500 for the demos and $353,200 for the new builds. And what that contemplates was demolitions at $7,500 each, so that the combination of city and county would wind up being $75,000. The new builds at $35,320 each, which we felt would be the subsidy necessary to make that happen and become profitable, with the city funding 10 and the county funding 20, so there's 30 of those. So that's the way that lays out in terms of where those dollars are for. And of course, that could go either way, less for demolitions, more for new builds, or vice versa. We sort of arbitrarily put some numbers in there, but to the extent we did fewer demolitions and more new builds, then certainly you would move more money from one to the other.
And can we do that with the Butler County funds without issue?
I'm thinking we can, because I think, again, we could explain that to them.
Okay.
But, the idea was that we were trying to revitalize the neighborhood. And my guess is they would love to see more new builds than they would demolitions. I guess I'm assuming that. But, it'd be nice if we didn't have to do as many demolitions. You always want to see more of something
Right.
new than tearing down an old. So.
Agreed.
For parks, not easy to fund a lot of park stuff. But what this contemplates in a couple of cases is those really high quality, portable bathrooms that sometimes you see at events that are very nice. They're just like regular bathrooms. They're like on a trailer and you haul them in. And by having them portable, we can get under the provision of hospitality tourism because they can be moved for events and they can be used there. But what we wanted to see primarily that they would be most of the time is one would be at Lefferson Park in order to support the pickleball that goes on there all the time and then could always technically be moved somewhere else. And then the other one would be at the airport to provide bathrooms for the new FBO. And again, also ultimately when that's solved longer term, could be moved somewhere else and used for events. And then there's additional funding of about $200,000 for other most needed prioritized things in parks, primarily in areas that are most negatively economically impacted by the pandemic, which would be determined. Moving down the list, we listed the Swallens lot. We think that's a high quality enough lot. We don't necessarily know that much in the way of incentive would be necessary there. The solar farm, we think we have other financing ways to deal with that at the old landfill. The Lincoln site for housing, again, we think it's going to be a high quality enough, that as well as Roosevelt both. We don't know that there'll be that much in the way of incentive necessary. The police department. We really need as a very high priority to totally redo the locker room facilities in this building on behalf of the police department. Chief Burke tells me that for $225,000 we can accomplish that. That certainly is eligible under social distancing and providing for those type of things, so falls within the availability. The fire department, because we've shown the fire stations in a different way, because we've now funded the ladder truck, we didn't see any high priority stuff that really fell in here that was necessary, so that fell off. Butler Tech Workforce, the airport aviation hangar facility, that is a separate request not having to do with the city, but that we've been supportive of to Butler County for $10 million. They're going to fund another $2 million through the state, and they're looking at about a $12 million hangar facility out there. I understand that that's getting some pretty good energy and support. They've had about 33 different letters of support for that. We just did a video today with John Graft from Butler Tech, just talking about how Butler Tech has been a great partner for us and kind of supporting that. So our hope is that they have success, because if they do, then that would be built on our airport and be, very much tied into what our economic development folks have been working on for a lot of years, and would be really a great addition to the airport and really help the aviation industry and workforce development that relates to the aviation industry.
Didn't the city have a grant for education at the airport?
We did at one time, and I'm going to look to others because it's before my time, and I'm not as familiar with it. Okay. I don't know if, Chriselle, did you know exactly what?
I know that they're trying to get some capital funding for something, but they never took advantage of it.
It was there, but it fell away in effect because it wasn't used. They couldn't match, I think, the other amounts of money that were necessary to match it. So, economic development grants, basically small business grants. This is clearly within the use. We saw CARES Act go to that. This would, refill another $325,000 for that. Our jail relocation, just too big of a project here to really be meaningful in any way to say, hey, we've got to find another way to do it. We still have to look state, federal, otherwise, so that's not funded. Multimodal facility, we'd love to do something in bringing our bus facility with a train facility and put them all by a train track. It's a longer term, bigger issue. There's probably a lot of federal funding coming up in the new infrastructure bill that certainly will look at multimodal. We'll look there, hopefully, for some help. Premium pay. We talked about how you calculate that, and we figured we needed to plug this in, but it was very difficult to sort of determine what that might be in advance, so I will tell you exactly what this number represents. $600,300 is taking all 384 of our employees, and that was the number we had when I first did this calculation, giving them $13 an hour for 3 weeks worth, or 120 hours, which works out to $1,560. So if there's any magic to that number, that's where it comes from. It could be changed or altered or given out in whatever policy-driven way we want to do it, but it does follow the methodology by making it $13 an hour. It would declare everybody an essential employee, which is technically okay, and it provides that amount of money, at least from a budget perspective, to be able to do something for premium pay. We're not suggesting that be the way to be done, but that's a way to be done, and that was the reason it was calculated that way.
Jim, I'm curious, would this only apply to employees that were here and working during the pandemic? So this would not include new employees, or anyone who is no longer employed with the city? How does
Also to be determined, you know, if you follow the legislation, you can go retro back to the very beginning. That could involve some people that don't work for us anymore. You can go through as long as the pandemic is on, so it could certainly involve some new employees, involve people that would be only here for part of the time. Or we could come up with ways that would say pro rata, based on the time you've been, you know, you might get a portion of it. None of that determined except to say, at least we're funding an amount that would take all 384 that exist by a certain amount of hours for that amount of money.
Just to be clear, that would exclude city council.
We could declare you essential.
I'm saying exclude.
Oh,
Yeah, not include.
I'm not making that policy decision. We did.
Should not include.
You're not included in the 384. You
Good.
aren't.
I'm just gonna-
But if you wanted to, you know, that's a
No.
discussion. That's a discussion to be had. So.
I would like to make a plug for our city staff who are on the front lines and exposed to the COVID virus, especially our police and fire, that they have a high, in my opinion, I believe that they are due to be called more essential monetarily than others in that kind of a funding situation. That's my
Absolutely, and
personal
that-
2 cents.
yeah.
I'm not speaking on behalf of all of council. I'm just,
And of course, the expenditure of it is very different than sort of a budget or an allocation. 'Cause,
yes,
yeah, agree.
I totally understand.
Those things would have to yet
Yep.
to be determined. MVB, the Middletown Visitors Bureau, we would like to, again, back to that negative economic impacts of the hospitality tourism business specifically. This is very much allowed for, contemplated in the legislation. And we really think we've got some really great projects that are coming up in the future that are tied to that business. And they've been operating on a shoestring for a long time. You know, we'd like to help fund them a little bit, particularly to do a lot of marketing and things in preparation for marketing on some of those things that are going to be coming. So hence the $225,000 going that direction. We had a specific line item that contemplated what the mayor was talking about, police premium pay. But because we wound up just calculating it all in the premium pay for all together, then we just zeroed that. So it all exists now within just premium pay for employees. So in combination, that makes up $18,925,000. We didn't budget the $154, so there's some flexibility there. It'll go back up.
Jim, for the Visitors Bureau, I'm curious what that number is in relation to sort of lost incomes that they would have received, from, what were their lost revenues from the bed tax? with
Yeah.
Hotels being,
We didn't do a deep dive on that, but obviously they went down significantly because they rely exclusively on those room taxes. I don't know the exact numbers. I don't know if it would amount to that much, but they certainly did have losses.
yeah, I just was curious how this number relates to that. I mean, certainly they play a big part in inviting people back out into the community, and I think that that's important, but I just was curious if you knew.
Yeah. So that's sort of the methodology. That's how we arrived at this. Again, trying to be as strategic as possible. I mean, our goal is to do every one of those projects listed on there in some manner, and this is an effort to try to see them all get done. You know, I'm greedy in that regard. I want to see the city get every single thing done, and if we're strategic enough with this, then maybe there's a way to get that accomplished, and that's what this tries to do.
are there any of the projects that if we do not receive the Butler County piece, they will fall off of the list? We can't accomplish them without that. In which case, we would move the funding elsewhere.
Well, let me sort of take, you know, the AK and the Serta demo and remediation, that would get delayed, but we would work exceptionally hard on the new brownfield stuff coming through the state, any grants like that. We would, you know, try to be first in line. We would, there are some of those programs coming. We would look to that, but it would be delayed because that's the way we're contemplating funding that.
But
The
would we still
paperboard.
be able to use the funds that we've allocated, I guess, would we still try to use those in the amount for the city ARPA dollars?
Oh, absolutely,
So we
yeah.
wouldn't move that to another priority because we couldn't.
No, I would not suggest it. I wouldn't, but,
Okay.
yeah.
we're just-
And I kind of want to jump off that topic because I'm sure all of our neighbors are going to be lobbying Butler County for dollars. And I think, between the five of us and city staff, that we really need to have some sort of organized campaign for how we are going to be communicating with them. And I know Shelby's kind of prepared a draft letter that interested parties could sign on to. And I really think I don't know how the best way is to do this, but I don't want somebody else in the county to get money that hopefully we've applied for and should receive. So I've kind of started making a list and would love to somehow divvy that up amongst all of us to kind of knock these out.
And I know it's only one county commissioner, but I think Commissioner Carpenter had put together a list that it effectively had all of our projects on it. So, I mean, in that regard, at least there's one commissioner who feels like our projects are, solid.
When
So,
do
yeah,
we
we,
have to decide by? August?
well, here's what they're doing is we just heard from them recently. Judy Boyko sent out a thing, and for the next several successive Wednesdays, and I think starting maybe with next Wednesday, they're going to have 20-minute sessions for each entity that have asked them for funding, that you can come in and do a presentation however you want with whoever does the presentation to show them why you should receive the funding, why it's eligible under the legislation, how it meets the federal guidelines, and why it's a higher priority than somebody else's. So, obviously we'll plan and prepare and do that as much as possible, but that would be, again, where you want as much support and, make it clear that as many people and people of influence and others can be there. And, for instance, like on that community center, all the various partnerships might be there and, get behind it and show why the support is there. We might be there to help support Butler Tech on their request because we know it's great for our community, and vice versa. They can come and help support us. So do as much of that as we can.
But do they have a drop date when they have to decide?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I think it's important for us in this next month,
Sure.
for them to be hearing and so,
Now, conversely, Warren County is very, very different. I think they're doing it much like what we're doing, which is basically they're going to make their own decisions. They're not really entertaining much in the way, but there's high-level staff at Warren County that really, truly believe in this project, have for a very long time, are carrying the water on this, and I feel pretty confident that we're in pretty good shape there. So there won't be any sort of presentations there or anything. It's the belief that they're pretty committed to that project, and I think, as long as we match it, they would match dollar for dollar. So.
And is that really our only project in Warren County that we would look to them to help us finance? Were there any other projects in Warren County that were considered?
The only thing that we would contemplate would be the Bender tract, but it's raw land and we don't really have any plan for it. Whereas the mall, we have an absolute detailed plan. So, and that's the thing about the ARPA is you really have to have been planning for it in advance of the funding.
Right.
So it wouldn't be eligible otherwise. So.
I guess I had one other thought. This has been running through my head a lot since Tuesday, since we met with the schools. I was talking to Dr. Urso afterwards, and we were both thinking, and I welcome your feedback, that we really need to get community buy-in. We probably need to have some sort of small group of 10 or 12 people that would get together and kind of plan, hey, this is the programming that's going to happen, at a community center, and, is it going to be Boys and Girls Club, or is it going to be the Y, or, who's going to be all involved in that? And I think you'd obviously want people, maybe from the Second Ward, or, from CBI, or maybe some of the major employers, and it just kind of wanted to take your guys' temperature. We were just kind of kicking it around in the backyard since our yard's literally a butt, and we were thinking maybe the school board would appoint half, and we would appoint half, and then there'd be a school board member and a council member or something. Are we way off base? Do you guys think this has value? It just seems like we need a next step to start to formulate potential programming, and then somebody else would have to deal with the endowment piece of it.
Yeah,
I thought they talked about that, didn't they? Wasn't that part of the plan to create a committee, or did I?
I think that was kind of
the next
sort of unsaid kind of concept, but I think when we were thinking about and would be bringing to you the 50,000 in CDBG money, it would be to support some entity, some committee, some group of stakeholders to start beginning that design, contemplation, facilitation, brainstorming effort
Right.
that has to figure out what it is.
Yeah, what's going to be there.
So
Yeah, I mean,
you
I
really
support
need
it. I
that,
just thought it was
that
already part of
entity,
it.
that group of all these, and the stakeholders seem to be primarily school and cities, so yeah.
So the conversation was like, well, how do we
Flesh that out.
do this? And
Sure.
it's like, I guess you guys get half, and I guess we get half, and there probably should be a council member and probably should be a school board member.
And you take applications the same way we do with other boards and commissions, or is it?
To be determined? I mean, that's kind of like why I'm raising the question is, you know,
I think it would be appropriate to allow people to raise their hand or entities to raise their hands, and then I think the way, unless we plan to meet as a large group regularly, I think splitting up the numbers is kind of the only way to go about
I think
that.
it has to be small enough, you know, you don't want 50 people.
No.
'Cause then you get nowhere. You know, it needs to be a small enough number that this has to be an action oriented.
And I know whoever's on the committee itself will get plenty of support from staffs of both the city and the schools. So I mean, the superintendent and Randy and others at the schools will help support his staff, will support. I'll be there, Susan will be there, Chriselle will be there. It'll get plenty of support, but the committee really needs to be that high-level decision maker. You guys are gonna figure it all. We're just gonna help you, you know, with whatever you need, so.
And I'm interested in working on it, so that's kind of the reason I raise it. But I don't know, maybe mull it over for, you know, a meeting. And maybe it can be a new business item, or maybe we're gonna have another work session. I don't know, but.
No, it's a valid point. I'm excited about the potential. For me, it's just sort of the question of what's the commitment from Butler County, because it's sort of, is it a $12 million project, or is it scaled back a little bit? And then that kind of determines how much.
I think they've been talking about a Plan A and a Plan B,
Yeah.
just from my work with CBI. So I think they've thought about coming up with those two different paths to take, so that
But you know,
whatever outcome you're somewhat prepared.
there's something to be said too, if you have a high-powered enough committee, it will get the attention of Butler County to maybe be more compelled to want to fund it too, so. Getting that done relatively soon, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, I think we should, I mean, how big do you think this committee should be?
I mean, I would be interested to be on it, but I'm not sure how many people
10,
we
10,
need,
15,
so.
I mean, maybe we could do 2 council members and 2 school board members.
I would only say big enough to be inclusive and small enough to get things done, whatever that means.
And they'd be public meetings, so there could be input from, you know, you could have people come and speak and have an input session. But decision-making wise, yeah, I think probably 12
Then
plus.
did you-
I think Amy very aptly pointed out, we are getting to the fringes of what we have announced as the special meeting. So I don't know, perhaps if council.
Topic?
We have to stay on the topics that we listed for the special meeting.
And isn't the, I mean,
Well, it's
I'm with
discussion
you. I
around a
understand
particular
that.
budget item, which is $2.1 million for a community center.
yeah.
I don't know that
in
you've
order to-
strayed too far from that.
To get to the Butler County funding for that, we can bring it up on Tuesday, but I think we have to talk about that soon. So if legal says we shouldn't discuss
As a
it,
new business item on Tuesday, we could maybe discuss.
we absolutely have to add it.
Yep.
So
Like
let's
a
do
good
it.
idea.
Yeah, it certainly can be added to that.
I think that process is starting now, and the idea is if you start having some thoughts on how you'd like to see that work. If you have any questions you'd like to talk to Jim and I about between now and then we could talk about.
Could we maybe solicit information, I assume Marlon's back in town, maybe staff, professional staff could have some conversations with them about if they think this sounds like a good idea, and if so, how many, and, you know,
Yeah.
if there's a board member or 2, or,
We'd love a staff proposal, and then we can talk about it. If you have a quick synopsis, maybe
We
Tuesday.
were,
You know,
we were
and-
trying to get you to make those decisions.
Okay, we can do that too.
you know, I was talking to Chris, and he was thinking, you know, if there is gonna be a Head Start program there, maybe Head Start needs to be, you know, at the table, or maybe the Butler County Education Service Center needs to be at the table. So, you know, if there's gonna be people providing program, maybe they need to be at the beginning, so just
Yeah.
things to
yeah.
think about.
And I would just add that I think we clearly heard you all the other night, both city council and school board, when you felt a little like we were too far ahead of things and pushing this a little hard. We want this to be organic, to be really coming from the policymakers. So it's your determination to who that committee is, who makes it up, because it's the communities. Think about it, this is a community center. It belongs to the community, belongs to all of you, figuring out how it gets done, all those things. We just want to support it. That's what we're here for.
So let's put a new business item on Tuesday.
All right.
And we can discuss committee.
Because we're actually
Sorry,
going to be
I veered off
discussing
again.
funding for that initial on Tuesday.
That's right, and that's actually on the agenda.
It is on the
That
agenda, so
could
that's
be
why I
part
thought
and
it would be
parcel to
better
all of it.
suited for that meeting.
It's the 50,000 that would go for the
Consultant.
consultant. And that sort of presupposes that a consultant would work for somebody. And I guess
Sounds
the
good.
somebody would be the committee.
I had a question, very brief one, about, I have this request for Butler County funding assistance under ARPA allocation. I printed that out from before. Has this been passed? Is this something?
Was it,
I'm not sure which email it was attached to.
You hold up
It's
the paper.
It's the long I printed it.
No.
yeah.
That's the
The
request that we sent
the
to Butler
original one actually got amended then by the second one that went for the community center.
They've not taken any official action on those. That's what Jim described as the series of Wednesday meetings to evaluate those projects, and then they'll make funding decisions.
So this is a draft the staff has put together, but not like an official presentation yet at the,
It was officially presented and given to Butler County,
okay,
because we wanted to be the first in line.
Okay.
We wanted to make our case, and yeah, absolutely, we did, and they got it.
great. Okay, sounds good. I was just looking for the status on that, so if we're ever speaking to said county officials.
That's what they're evaluating on these series of meetings.
Well, it looks like staff's put in a lot of effort to prioritize and consider dollar amounts, and I'm grateful for staff getting, I don't want to say ahead of, because no one could have gotten ahead of, but right on the ball with planning.
And I think the thing too is, the idea would be create a budget that looks like this. You pass the budget, but then we don't make any expenditures of any kind except for individual allocations that come back to you. So let me take an example. You pass this budget, it shows celluloid $7,750,000. That hasn't given us authority yet to spend $1. But then we come back to you in 2 weeks and say, we need 250,000 of that allocated to do professional services on behalf of celluloid. Or, because by doing that, we also have the ability then later to be adaptive to the things that may not happen, that may not get funded, and then we can come back and alter that budget. Whereas if we approve it such that it's allocation, that's sort of cast in stone. We're not asking for that. We're looking for a budget that says generally this is what we're budgeting, but then you can't spend a penny of it unless each time you're coming back for a specific allocation. So then you'd have details. So then it would be, okay, if we come back for MVB for 225,000 or some portion of that 225, it'd be like anything else that you see. It would be, oh, here's $82,000 and it's for this marketing campaign and we want to give it to MVB and it's coming out of ARPA. And it was the original ARPA, 225. Or premium pay, there's some determination made on it and then it comes back. Or a cleanup, hey, we want to do a small cleanup in the fall for 20,000 and a big cleanup in the spring for 130 and we come for the first one of 20, whatever that is, so.
And we can start spending, we have 9 million now, so we can.
We can spend these dollars anytime you as a council authorize it and allocate it, which obviously we haven't done, so it's sitting in a bank. We don't have a budget yet.
I guess
We'd like to
that's
sort
the
of start with a budget and then
Right.
start with allocations from there.
But if-
But it's a multi-year budget too. So
Sure.
this will not be included as part of your budgeting process. We want to do this entirely separate because it's a 4-year budget.
And is this something that we will do annually then? We'll go back and look and see how much money of the,
We'll
ARPA money we've
review it
spent and how much-
annually, yes, with potential for amendments, but effectively you're approving a 4-year budget when you start.
Okay.
And then what you'll do is amend it in the future, but you won't sort of approve yearly budgets. It might just be amendments. Those could happen mid-year, they could a year, whenever.
But we
'Cause it's a
can-
long,
We can hope for future work sessions to come back to this and reevaluate.
yeah. But we'd really love to see you approve an ARPA budget before you approve your regular budget. Get it done, get it out of the way, and have it sort of independent. Because then you'll know in advance what's been done with ARPA that you don't have to worry about with the regular budget. So, you know, what is our budget hearings are coming up
They'll be in October.
in October. So, you know, if we could get this approved in September, then, you know it in advance, you
So
know.
is this gonna go to, like, does it need a formal approval, like a first reading, second reading kind of thing? Or is it like a
It all
gut
depends
feeling?
on how
we
you
kinda
want to
say
do it.
go
Yeah, I
with
mean, if
it?
it's just a normal process, then it would, you know, typically budget takes multiple, or how do we do it?
This is a special issue, and we're not authorizing the individual payments, so we could do it any of the options we had. This could be a one reading and a second
But
reading.
does it
emergency.
require like an approval of council to approve this ARPA budget? Or is it just like, hey, we feel good, like kind of?
We will
So
ask,
we're establishing a process that we feel is appropriate to have a budget the same way you have a regular budget. So
we will ask
need
you
a
to
budget.
approve a budget.
Like a resolution or something?
We will ask you to
Budget
approve a
resolution.
budget.
Yep.
That's what I was getting at, okay.
And so we'll see this as a resolution on Tuesday, or will that be?
It will not
It
be
won't be that
Tuesday, but
fast.
I imagine we will come back in September and say, this is what we believe the budget to be, and we're asking you to pass a resolution. That gives staff some idea that, you know, this is official, this is the priorities of council. And then when we spend the individual dollars, we would come back for those allotments, but we can have something to judge it against so that we know we're maintaining what council's priorities are for the money.
And would we expect to, when there's not county money involved, kind of be working down from the top in terms of then starting to spend? So are you coming to council in October and the first thing is gonna be the cleanup money, or, you know, is this where the priority?
No, this is not in order of expenditure, more in order of priority. So it could come from anywhere on here as
Okay.
far as the
So
allocation.
you could come in September and say, we wanna do the premium pay. So
Sure.
this- Okay.
Absolutely.
That's what I
Or
was,
the MVB, or.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I'm just curious on the cleanup, is that just, because I don't think we've done one of these in my time, but is that just rolling up a dumpster and letting people throw stuff in, or is it like somebody professional that's coming in? Because there's alleys that nobody's gonna go in and grab stuff and throw it away, like, is it just volunteer led?
What we'd like to do is have enough time to plan in advance for a sort of citywide weekend cleanup where we organize people to clean alleys. We have big dumpsters placed in multiple locations around the city that are manned by people that can help people bring things and throw it out. We have a hazardous waste place at the same time that we have an electronics thing at the same time. We have a tire and a white goods and just general dumpsters so that people don't have to pay to bring whatever they have in the spring. All those kinds of things to just really give it a one-time, clean up the community, get people behind it,
Mainly resident.
clean up your neighbors, clean up the parks, clean up the alleys, but we'll have all these things available too to help and support.
And Keep Middletown Beautiful has
Absolutely,
has
partner with
worked
Keep
towards
Middletown
these
Beautiful.
things in the past, but they have a hard time getting the manpower and the donations and just all of the things that they need
We
to
would,
make that kind of
by
thing
that
happen.
time, we'd have our community folks that
Community
are,
service.
community service
support.
people,
We've been in contact
court
with Business
people.
Shuttle.
A piece of
you know, we'd have that arranged so that they could help with those alley cleanups, with the dumping out and all that.
Chriselle and I talked about outreach to businesses. Perhaps some of our businesses want to come out and help the communities they're in and help, you know, people that may not be able to help clean up their houses. There's groups you can get that would help do some of those projects that might help.
Yeah, might have some contests too. We were
challenging
thinking
to-
about
Execute.
offering significant prizes for neighborhoods, like the more tons of stuff or bags or whatever, for your neighborhood, you'll win a play structure in your park or something, you know.
You get a park bench.
You get a park bench or whatever, you know, something that gets people wanting to do more of it, you know. So again, we're brainstorming it, but the idea was to have enough funds there so that it would really do something. I guess the remarkable thing is, I don't think any of us would have ever imagined we had the opportunity to have these discussions, you know, a year ago, or maybe ever in our entire careers. So it's really, really exciting in that regard. When you think about the potential seed funding that will make a difference for so many of these projects that we otherwise never contemplated could ever really happen. So, I mean, it's pretty cool. So.
Any other comments or questions from council this time, or anything else you want to add, Jim?
Nothing further on my, Rochelle, Susan, did you have anything further?
Thank you.
We do just have the one item of
We have another item. Should be fairly quick.
Are you ready?
Susan, would you like to present the legislation for this evening now? Yeah.
We do have one matter for your consideration this evening. We are asking you to declare as an emergency for ordinance O 2021-66. To ask for a motion to waive the charter requirement to 30 days to enactment.
I move to waive the charter provision requiring readings on 2 separate days, and then ordinance number O 2021-66 be declared an emergency and read one time only.
Second?
Ms. Skank, will you please call the roll?
Mayor Condrey,
Yes.
Ms. Vettori,
Yes.
Ms. Nenny,
Yes.
Mr. Moon,
Yes.
Mr. Mulligan.
Yes.
Sole matter for your consideration this evening is ordinance O 2021-66, an ordinance to authorize the city manager to accept the material terms of the One Ohio subdivision settlement pursuant to the One Ohio Memorandum of Understanding and consistent with the terms of the July 2021 National Opioid Settlement, and to sign the One Ohio subdivision participation form and declaring an emergency.
So move for adoption.
Second?
Any comments or questions?
Just one comment, Your Honor. We did review this with counsel and outside counsel that was representing the city, and obviously, the $1.1 million that the city might receive over the next 18 years is grossly inadequate to the impact on families in our community and public safety forces and neighborhoods, and obviously all the downstream issues created by the opioid epidemic, whether it's crime, broken families, et cetera. But it's a pittance compared to that, but at least we're getting some monetary compensation, so happy to support it.
Yeah. And I was thinking along the same lines, you know, this doesn't change the broken families and the broken lives and what it did to our community and so many communities throughout the state. I just hope, and we will put this to good use to help those that were impacted and the families that were impacted, but it will never replace the brokenness that they've gone through. So I'm happy to support it as well.
The other note is that there is oversight written into this to try to prevent it from happening again. So that's really important in my mind. Okay. Ms. Skank, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Vettori,
Yes.
Ms. Nenny,
Yes.
Mr. Moon,
Yes.
Mr. Mulligan,
Yes.
Mayor Condrey.
Yes.
all we
With
have
that,
this evening. Thank you
that's
very
the end of our special meeting. We will meet next on August 17th, Tuesday evening at 17:30 or 5:30 p.m. here in council chambers. Until then, blue skies over Middletown.